Our scripture reading this morning comes from Genesis. I invite you to follow along in your bulletins with me as I read it aloud. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So after that you may pass on." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." Here ends the reading.
And Sarah laughed. Oh, how she laughed. It started with a giggle that went right up through her middle to a chuckle bursting forth. A chortle, then a roar. She threw back her head and she laughed. An angel came one day to Abraham and said, "Your wife will bear a son." And Sarah laughed as she hid behind the door. Did the Lord not know she was almost 94? And Sarah laughed. Oh, how she laughed. It started with a giggle that came right up through her middle to a chuckle bursting forth. A chortle, then a roar. She threw back her head and she laughed. Jesus saw Simon there with empty nets and said, "Cast them out again." laughed. Oh, yes, they laughed. It started with a giggle that came right up through their middle. First a chuckle bursting forth, a chortle, then a roar. They all threw their heads back and they laughed.
So last week in my sermon, I shared that the summer of 2016 was a really hard season in my life. But today I'm going to share with you a story that happened to me in the summer of 2017, which was a much better summer. That's the summer I met my now husband, and I got to spend a month in Europe. So it was a wonderful summer. The first 2 weeks I was in Europe, I was in Leipzig, Germany, as a delegate to the World Communion of Reformed Churches, celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. So that was a wonderful experience. And then the second 2 weeks I was in Europe was for a family vacation. I met up with my two parents and my two brothers in Leipzig, and we had what we called the Wells Family Euro trip. Andy was not with us because, he wasn't part of the family yet. He didn't have the privilege of coming on the family vacation. So I meet up with my parents and my two brothers, and remember, my brothers and I are full-grown adults at this time. My older brother and I are in our 30s, my younger brother's in his 20s, and my dad rents a car so that we can travel around Germany and Prague and Poland and visit some family and go to different cities. Well, on the whole, cars in Europe are smaller than cars in the United States. And my father is one of the most frugal men you will ever meet. How do you get a cheaper rental car? You get a smaller one. And so my dad rented the smallest 4-door, 5-seater car available in Europe. And we squeezed into this car like sardines, my two parents in the front, my dad driving, and my mom the passenger. And then my two brothers and I squeezed in the back seat. So we were quite a sight to behold, and we used the GPS. It was an onboard GPS system connected to the car, which we needed to help us get around. And of course, it was only in German. So my mom is the only one in our family who speaks very limited German, but she has to translate the instructions from German into English for my father. And you can imagine that this is going really well. So I don't speak German, but I do know the way the language works is they take 5 English words and smash them together and make one really long German word that has like 20 syllables. And so my brothers and I think that what is coming out of the audio of this car is hysterical. And that all the words end in Platz and Strasse, because that means place and street. And those are the 2 words we just hear coming out of this GPS repeatedly. And if that's not ridiculous enough, somehow the radio and the GPS system in the car are connected. So if you want to have the GPS audio, you have to have the radio on. We couldn't figure out how to turn the radio off and leave the GPS on. The radio going off also turned off the GPS. So now we have to have the radio on. And the only station we could get to tune in, and come through clearly was a polka station. That was it. And so we're squeezed into this car with like the very kind of polka music you're imagining. Very upbeat, high energy, non-stop polka. Interspersed with the GPS blasting German directions at us, and then my mom has to speak over the polka to translate the directions to my father. So he committed some sort of driving infraction. I don't know what it was, but we got pulled over by a German police officer because I don't think we were particularly inconspicuous on the road. So we get pulled over, and my brothers and I think this is hilarious. Like, again, we are grown adults, but we have reverted to our childhood roles. We might as well be 10-year-olds in the back of the car on the family road trip. My parents are very stressed out. My mom is trying to translate for the German police officer who doesn't speak English, and my dad is worried that, we're going to have the car impounded, where this is going to ruin our vacation. Are we going to get a ticket? Are we going to lose our license? What's going to happen? They're so consumed with talking to the cop that they don't turn off the music. And so the polka music just continues to play. Now, I wish this story had a more climactic ending, but the police officer just, I think, was so frustrated and disgusted with us that he just gave us a very stern German warning. Like, they are not rule breakers, right? They like the rules. It was a very stern warning and let us go on our way. So we finally make it to our hotel. That was our destination. And as soon as we open the doors, we just come spilling out of this car like a clown car. And, the trunk opens up and the luggage comes falling out. But we made it, and all things were relatively well for the rest of the trip, except for the fact that we were really squeezed in there every time we got in the car. But my dad saved a couple dollars, so, it was worth it. So this is a story that lives on in my family, and we tell it all the time, and it always brings us great joy. You might have stories that you've shared with friends or family, and every time you think about them, they just make you giggle. Or maybe when you get together, you share the story again. Tell those stories. Keep those memories alive, even if they change from the day it happened to 10 years after the story is told and it's nothing like what actually happened. Keep telling the stories. We need the humor and the joy. I think of these moments of hilarity as like shimmering gemstones, dotting the timelines of our lives. They're so, so precious. And we laugh for all kinds of different reasons. We can laugh because of hilarity and absurdity. We can laugh because we're self-conscious. And we can laugh because we're afraid or worried or bewildered. And that's why I think Sarah laughed in today's story that we heard in the book of Genesis. So this story went something like this. The three men approach Abraham in his tent, and he does the hospitable thing and tells Sarah to make the cakes and kills the fatted calf, and they have a feast. And then the men, one of them, who's God in disguise, asks Abraham, "Where's Sarah?" Now, the gender roles at the time were such that the men, or the head of the household, was the host, and he greeted the guests, and the women stayed in the domestic realm in the kitchen or in the tent and were out of sight. That's the patriarchy for you. Okay, so Abraham says Sarah's in the tent, and these men actually came to see her. So he says, presumably loudly enough so she can hear, "When I come back next year, you will have a son." And Sarah betrays her role. She's supposed to be quiet and unobtrusive. She laughs. She just lets out a laugh. She can't help herself. This is bizarre. You're telling me I'm going to have a son? No way. And so she goes on to talk and says, "My husband and I are old, and you think you can give me pleasure?" Now, we're going to get PG-13 for a moment, because pleasure is not a euphemism. She means, like, you think he can really please me and make a child. And what's interesting about this word pleasure is that it's the same Hebrew word earlier in Genesis that's translated as Eden. It's the same word. And in Genesis 1 and 2, it's translated as Eden. And here it's translated as pleasure. And it means luxury or delight. So she's asking God, "You think at our old age that my husband can really take delight in me and we can experience pleasure together?" And I think it's a really sweet display of her humanity. And so then God responds and says, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I bear a child now that I'm old?'" She didn't say that. She didn't say that at all. God, I don't know, might have been feeling a little prudish, but when God quotes Sarah, God censors her, and makes it a little more family appropriate, and asks Abraham, why did she laugh, and ask this question, questioning whether she's going to have a child or not. And Sarah, for her part, does not let Abraham speak for her. She answers the question directly. Now, I don't know if she's still in the tent or if she's come out of the tent by this point. We don't get stage directions, but she answers and she says, "I didn't laugh because she was afraid, which we'll get to. And then God says, "Oh, yes, you did." And that's where the scene ends. So this could be interpreted as God admonishing Sarah, chastising her and accusing her of being unfaithful and irreverent, kind of like how dare you laugh at the plans I've shared with you. But I think God calling Sarah out on her laughter is showing approval and giving permission and saying, it's okay that you laugh. This is absurd. And saying that it's okay that you laughed and I approve of it. And this reaction was totally normal and appropriate. Of course she was afraid. First of all, throughout most of human history, the number one cause of death for women has been childbirth. Okay? So she's probably literally deathly afraid that this pregnancy might kill her. Remember, she's in her early 90s. Pregnancy and childbirth killed young and healthy women, not to mention someone who's in their 90s. And then, if she does survive it, what kind of toll is this going to take on her body? Labor and delivery is incredibly taxing on a younger body, right? Not to mention hers. And then if she heals from the pregnancy and labor and delivery, now she's in her early 90s and she's caring for a newborn. So I don't know if you know much about newborns, but they are a lot of work. They cry all the time. They don't sleep. They're exhausting and very frustrating. So she's thinking to herself, I have settled into my old age nicely with Abraham, and now you're going to put me through this. Of course she has every reason to be afraid. Now, this is the first time Sarah's hearing this news. But believe it or not, Abraham already knew. Now, if God appeared to my husband and told him that he and I were going to have a son, I would have expected my husband to immediately turn around and tell me. But that doesn't happen. In Genesis 17, God appears to Abraham and tells him, you and Sarah are going to have a son. And how does Abraham react? He falls on his face with laughter. That is a direct quote from the Bible. He falls on his face with laughter. And Sarah, she doubted God and was like, no way, you've got to be crazy. Well, Abraham doubted too. And when God told Abraham, his reaction was, after he picked his face up off the floor from laughing, oh, I must have misunderstood. You meant Ishmael, my son Ishmael is going to have a son. Because remember, Abraham had a son Ishmael with his concubine Hagar. The family tree gets very complicated. And God says, no, I didn't misspeak. Your son Ishmael is not having a son. You and Sarah are having a son. And then God goes on to tell Abraham, you will name your son Isaac. You know what Isaac means in Hebrew? He who laughs. So Abraham laughed at the news. God tells him, you'll name your son he who laughs. So, of course, it makes perfect sense that when Sarah, the mother who's going to actually have the child, when she finds out, she laughs too. There's humor all over the place. And if anyone ever tells you that the Bible is boring, they are not reading the right parts. So, I don't know anything about tools. If you open up a toolbox, I might be able to identify a screwdriver. But I do know what a multi-tool is. You know, those things that fold down and turn into pliers and have other things that come out of them and do other stuff. So I think of laughter and humor as like a multi-tool. It can be used as a coping mechanism. It can be used just in the face of absurdity. It can be weaponized, right? We can use laughter to demean and hurt and belittle people. And laughter can be a sign of humility. I love people who can laugh at themselves, who don't take themselves too seriously. I have had a lot of pastoral care sessions with folks whose lives have gone sideways. And they've just had one awful experience after another. And a lot of times they laugh. And then they'll say something to the effect of, you gotta laugh, otherwise you'll cry, right? If the company you keep is never able to laugh at themselves, that's a red flag. Because if you can't laugh at yourself, that means you take yourself too seriously and you think you're in control and you have it all in hand. And you run the risk of deifying yourself and making an idol out of you rather than having humility and reliance on God. When we can laugh at ourselves, it means that we are acknowledging that God is in control, that I am not. That I am only a small piece of a larger puzzle and I cannot get through this life by myself. Laughter is a gift that we have been blessed with, and there are lots of ways to use it. It can be used to deflect. You might have known people that laugh when they're in trouble or when they made a mistake. My children laugh all the time when they've been caught doing something. It can be used to harm, but it can be used to connect us with each other, and connect us with God. It can be a coping mechanism to get us through what life hands us and can humble us and remind us that it is God who is in control. May we have the wisdom to use the gift of laughter wisely. Amen.